Miss Nobody from Nowhere by Elizabeth Ashton. Chapter 5. Mrs. Newcombe was a lively widow who was doing a tour of the Middle East. An early riser, she had seen Clive go out in the morning, bearded and bulky, and return transformed, carrying Angela's box of clothes. She pumped the reception clerk, and having ascertained his name and occupation, waited for him to come down to breakfast, which, having found Angela still sleeping, he did. Seating herself at the next table to his, she introduced herself, pretending a great admiration for his books, of which she had never heard previously and had certainly never read. Clive was at first unresponsive, until it occurred to him that she might be of help to Angela, and he then unbent. When Angela came down to dinner that evening, he presented her to the widow, and the shopping expedition was arranged for the following morning. Mrs. Newcombe was small, plump, and vivacious, with buxom good looks. She was in her early 40s, with brown hair and inquisitive hazel eyes, alert to probe her neighbour's business. Here we go. Since I lost my poor Albert, I don't seem able to have settled down. What should I do? I don't know. If she's in here for a lot, so I'm going to really regret doing that. Who knows? That's not the point of the show. Since I lost my poor Albert, I don't seem to be able to settle down. She concluded. What am I doing? Since I lost my poor Albert. No, that's better. Since I lost my poor Albert, I don't seem to be able to settle down, she confided to Angela. Fortunately, he left me enough to indulge my restlessness. You see, we had no family, which I don't regret. Modern youth is too much for a lone widow woman to cope with. Next day, she conducted Angela into the new town with its modern shops and wide avenues. The dark alleys of the bazaars behind the waterfront, though more intriguing, were not safe, she insisted, for two unprotected women. Kabul is not a distinguished town. It sprawls along its straggling river without shape or architectural style. In spring, the river is a raging torrent, but in summer it shrinks to a series of stagnant pools in which its population simultaneously pray, wash clothes, water camels, and relieve themselves. At the time of Angela's visit, the river had begun to recede and its residents foregather on its banks. One thing is beautiful. Though Kabul is situated on a plain, there is a vista of mountains at the end of every street, the vanguard of the several ranges that ring the city. Knowing that the summer would be before her, when she reached England, Angela bought thin trousers and tops, several light dresses, and the necessary underwear and nightdresses. Clive, she was sure, would not appreciate pyjamas. Remembering his parting injunction with a blush, she was extravagant over a diaphanous negligee. Mrs. Newcombe was lavish with advice and suggestions, but her taste was all for frills and fussiness, whereas Angela liked plain styles. Of all she bought, it was only the negligee of which her companion really approved. Over coffee and cakes in a very westernized cafe, their conversation inevitably turned towards Clive, with whom the widow was obviously smitten. You are lucky, my dear, to have such a charming man, she said enviously, and so good-looking. Privately, she thought he had thrown himself away upon Angela. The girl was handsome, but so young and gauche. She had looked sceptically at Angela's ringless hands, for that was a detail Clive had overlooked, and Angela had told her a little lamely that she had lost her wedding ring. As well as your luggage? Dear me, you were unfortunate, Mrs. Newcombe had exclaimed, obviously disbelieving that she had ever had one. However, the widow prided herself upon being a woman of the world, and not easily shocked, and she was wondering if Clive could be detached from his liaison with this girl whose naivety must surely be beginning to pall. So she set herself to find out all she could about this incongruous couple, and was a little disappointed when Angela told her they would be leaving for England within a few days' time. I'm sorry. Just when I was getting to know you. It's so seldom that one meets really compatible people, Mrs. Newcombe said with emphasis. We'll have to make the most of what time we have together. Angela thought Clive had made a mistake by encouraging this woman, whom she did not find compatible at all, but he had so much to do he was glad to know that Angela had company. Her exit visa entailed several interviews with various officials, and there was the wedding arrangements to make, besides some private business, so he had to leave her very much alone. At lunch, Mrs. Newcombe managed to get herself transferred to their table in the hotel dining room, and did what she could to monopolise Clive's attention. The waiters winked at each other covertly. The Sahib was getting himself another wife. He must be rich enough to support two. And this second one, though a little mature, was much more bedworthy by their standards. She would keep the little one in order, and it was all humbug that the British were monogamists. Angela watched Mrs. Newcome's eye play and wondered if Clive was impressed. If Clive were impressed, yes. She was not exactly jealous, but she did not enjoy the widow's blatant advances. Clive, she thought, responded a little too readily to her sallies. She wondered if his susceptibility to women extended to others besides herself. At dinner time, catching sight of the widow firmly ensconced at their table, she waited in the foyer to waylay Clive as he came in. "I don't know why you had to ask her to join us," she complained. "I want you to myself." "I don't think I did," he returned. "She asked herself." He gave her a narrow glance. "Don't start becoming possessive, Angela. I won't stand for it, and I should have thought you'd have had enough of my sole company." Nettled by his tone, she began sharply. "Of course, if you're tired of me already—" He interrupted her. "That's enough, Angela. Mrs. Newcombe has been very kind looking after you while I have to be out." "I'm not a baby, or do you think I need a duenna?" she asked heatedly. "I think she suspects we aren't married." "That's soon going to be remedied." His hand closed on her arm in a vice-like grip. "Come in to dinner and behave yourself. This evening I'm going to take you to visit some Pushtu friends of mine. They may be an object lesson to you." Angela was so ruffled she was about to tell him she did not want an object lesson and he could go and visit his friends by himself, but realizing that she would be left to her own devices, she checked herself in time. At least Mrs. Newcombe would be left behind. Ayub Khan lived in an old house on a mountainside above the city. Angela and Clive were ushered into a dim, cool room, lit by kerosene lamps in beautiful wrought-iron brackets, dispersing a mellow glow over the rich rugs and piled cushions on the floor. At one end was a raised divan with more cushions. Their host came to greet them, a man of about 50, wearing a western suit and a caracul hat. He embraced Clive affectionately. Apparently they were old friends, and bowed ceremoniously to Angela. Various other men appeared, sons, nephews. Angela never discovered who was who. She had an impression of flashing dark eyes and aquiline faces. They all conversed in Pushtu, which Angela could not understand. Only when they had all been presented did the women of the household appear, as was customary, bringing a white cloth to lay upon the floor, the inevitable tea, and sweetmeats, and large bowls of pistachio nuts. One of the young men introduced Angela to a handsome middle-aged woman, wearing a sort of white sari about her head and shoulders. "My mother," he said in English. Then a much younger woman, also with her head covered, though none of them were veiled. "My other mother." The two ladies sat on either side of their husband on the divan. The others grouped themselves about the room. Angela found she was expected to sit cross-legged upon cushions on the floor, and she hoped her tights would not run, and she was not showing too much leg. Then the young children were brought in to be shown to the visitors, toddlers, and even babies. All were quiet and well-behaved, as Muslim children are taught to be. Angela had no idea as to who belonged to whom, or how many families the patriarchal roof sheltered. Ayub Khan was definitely a patriarch, smiling benignly upon all and sundry, but there seemed to be no friction. An atmosphere of calm happiness and sanctity pervaded the whole family, and both wives had an air of smiling serenity. A girl came to sit beside Angela, anxious to show off her English. She had learned it, she said, at school, which she had permission to attend. Education was being extended to girls, though it was not yet universal. "I hope," she said, "to become—" Oh, no, sorry. I hope she said. To become a teacher, though eventually I expect to marry. Afghan? I don't know. I hope, she said, to become a teacher, though eventually I expect to marry. Which I know it's Indian. Her eyes went to Clive, who had retreated into a corner with one of the elder men and was discussing Afghan politics, with occasional interpolations from their host. So that is your man, she said. You are fortunate to have such a fine one. He might even make a buzkashi player. Angela had to confess ignorance of buzkashi, and her companion hastened to enlighten her. It was the national game of Afghanistan, a sort of polo played with a headless goat instead of a ball. The horsemen struggled for possession of the carcass, which once obtained had to be hauled across their saddles and carried so many times around the field before being deposited in a pit. But the horseman was intercepted by other players, and fierce battles took place in which the horses joined. Afghans were superb horsemen, the finest in the world. We girls make the players our heroes, the girl said, her great dark eyes flashing. No languishing Indian film stars for us. I have pictures of all the famous ones. Pin-ups, Angela suggested. The girl giggled. That is so. All round the room I share with my sisters. Pin-ups. She repeated the word, seeming pleased with this addition to her vocabulary. A male should be arrogantly male, she asserted, sounding like she was Welsh. Oh, quite, Angela agreed, a little out of her depth. She glanced at Clive. Did her companion see him as arrogantly male? He was autocratic at times, but she did not think he had much in common with these savage horsemen whom the Afghan girl so much admired. As it was a fine night, Clive suggested that they should walk back to the city, and eager to prolong her time in his company, Angela concurred. Sorry, it's late. They walked along arm in arm, discussing the harmony that seemed to exist in Ayub Khan's motley household. But I should hate to have to share you with another woman, Angela remarked. Most women do share their husbands, Clive returned cynically, though they don't know it. In Moslem countries there are no spinsters, which is all to the good. On the principle that half a man is better than none, Angela suggested. Definitely, and they have their children to fulfill themselves. Do you then sponsor polygamy? Not at all, and in any case it's dying out for economic reasons. Men can't support more than one wife. But Eastern women, unlike their Western sisters, still regard the family as the be-all and the end-all of their lives. Perhaps they won't when they're better educated. The pity of education is going to make them discontented. Yours is a very masculine point of view, isn't it, Clive? After all, I'm a man, he observed dryly, and you must admit the Ayub family seemed very happy. Yes, well, they're Afghans, Angela said vaguely. She was recalling that Clive had had another wife, and he still regretted her. As if he sensed her thought, he said, A man can care for two women, Angela, without lessening his feeling for either. Moonlight was painting the mountains that ringed the city in black and silver, a vast horizon wild and free like the spirit of its people. Angela pressed the arm she held affectionately. He was trying to tell her that although Jasmine had had the love of his youth, he had room in his heart for her too. Jasmine had been dead 9 years, and all the future was hers. They were married at the British mission. Angela gave her maiden name as Nunn, which but for the spelling was correct. Parents unknown. Regarding her date of birth, she told Clive she was sure that she had been born in the spring. She had some hazy recollection of a big party with the table decorated with spring flowers, tulips predominating. The wild ones in Afghanistan had rung a bell. And I think I must be 21, she said. That was why it was such a big do. Though 21 had rather lost its significance with the lowering of the coming of age to 18, Angela looked too mature for 18, so she decided it must have been her 21st. Her speech was definitely British, and that was all the meagre information she could supply about herself. Clive gave her birthday as March the 21st, the first day of spring, and hoped he was not perjuring himself. He gave Angela another ring, besides her wedding one, an Egyptian scarab, a necklace of lapis lazuli, because that stone was mined in Afghanistan, and it was to be a memento of their stay there. I didn't think you were sentimental, she said when she had thanked him. No more I am, but I thought it would be appropriate, he told her hastily. He seemed to think it was a crime to betray any sentiment. Over the scarab, she bent her brows. It seemed to have familiar associations. Excuse me. I wonder if my people were interested in archaeology, she observed. Perhaps I really did come here on a dig. Clive looked black. I hope not. His tone was curt. I don't like archaeologists. But he refused to tell her why. Sorry. After the simple ceremony, he moved back into her room at the hotel, and during a night of pain and rapture, Angela had proof that she had not been married before. Clive's love-making was alternately fierce and tender, and when the day dawned, Angela disengaged herself from his arms on the narrow bed that they had shared, with the full knowledge that she loved him deeply and irrevocably. She left him to sleep while she took her shower, and her heart sang a paean of triumphant joy. She was his, and he was hers, and nothing should ever part them. Breakfast had been ordered to be sent up to their room. Neither were in the mood to encounter Mrs. Newcombe. When it had been eaten, and Clive had gone to shave, Angela idly leafed through some pictures of the high spots in Afghanistan, issued by the Afghan Tourist Board, feeling pleasantly languid. She came upon a large picture of the colossal Buddha at Bamiyan. It was carved in a niche in the mountain wall, which was honeycombed with ancient cells once inhabited by religious monks, for Bamiyan had been a great centre of Buddhism, thronged with priests and pilgrims, until Genghis Khan and his hordes came over the Oxus and devastated the country in 1221. Bamiyan had been particularly unfortunate. Situated in a long valley, it was guarded by 2 fortified cities at each end. They had refused to surrender to the Mongols, and in the battle for their possession, the great Khan's favourite grandson had been shot by an arrow. In revenge, the grieving grandfather had proclaimed that no living thing was to be left alive in the valley, and so it was. Every man, woman, and child, beast and bird were slaughtered. Even the trees were cut down, the barley slashed from its root. The valley became a place of desolation. It was considered accursed, and for 100 years it was totally abandoned. When eventually men crept back to take up life there, they built little farming villages among neat fields, but the 2 great figures of the Buddha, one much smaller than the other, were still there, though defaced and mutilated, now objects of interest to the archaeologists who were beginning to throng Afghanistan to excavate the centuries of history that were buried in its soil. Some vague memories of Bamiyan's story filtered back into Angela's consciousness as she stared at the picture. She called to Clive excitedly. "Clive, I know that place. I've been there. I recognise the statue." He came to join her and looked from the print to her flushed face. He had always expected that some association would eventually recall her past to her, and this might be it. "We must go there," he decided promptly. "Our flight is booked for 2 days hence, so if we start at once we can spend a night there and be back in time to catch it." Angela's mood changed as apprehension submerged her first excitement. "Don't let's bother," she said quickly. She was so happy in her new life, she dreaded a revelation that might mar it. Some premonition warned her that the discovery of her identity might be a threat to it. But Clive was determined to go. If Bamiyan could restore Angela's memory, it would be better than any psychiatric probings. Reluctantly, Angela allowed her misgivings to be overruled. Clive had hired a car, and as soon as they were dressed, they set off. The spring rains were past, and the sky was blue and cloudless. The road led through the Kopi Daman valley. Along one side of it were mountains, brown and grey, crisscrossed with a faint tracery of shepherd's trails beaten hard by the countless hoofs of the herds. On the other side were neatly laid out fields, each rimmed with a low mud wall and laced with little irrigation ditches. Against the treeless landscape, kingfishers flashed like bits of iridescent enamel, and big black and white magpies sauntered through the fields. They passed Istalif, with green woods tucked into a ravine, and stopped at Sharikar to buy kebabs from the bazaar, lamb and young kid, crisp and smoking, and slabs of fresh bread. Then they turned west into the gorge of the Horban River. The road lay along the bottom of a deep slot carved by the water between sheer cliffs, the stream running beside it. Thence over the Shibar Pass and on towards Bamiyan. A few miles before reaching the mouth of the valley, Clive pulled up in the dusty road at the foot of a mountain and pointed to an overgrown pathway winding upward. On the cliffs above her, Angela could discern crumbling turrets and desolate walls. "Shah-e-Golgola," Clive told her, "the city of clamour and lamentation." It was one of the two built at either end to protect the valley, and it has never been rebuilt since Genghis Khan destroyed it. It's said that in the night those broken towers echo with the wails of the doomed who were murdered there. Oh, it... sorry, Shari Golgola, Clive told her, the city of clamour and lamentation. It was one of the two built at either end to protect the valley, and it has never been rebuilt since Genghis Khan destroyed it. It's said that in the night those broken towers echo with the wails of the doomed who were murdered there. Angela shivered. The red sandstone walls of the gorge behind them were flushed in the red light of the sinking sun to the colour of blood. Her face was white and strained, for throughout the journey she had been strung to recall whether she had passed that way before. Certain features appeared to be familiar, like scenes seen in a dream. Also, she seemed always to have known the story of Bamiyan's destruction. Would the great Buddha bring everything back to her, and how was she going to react? Whoever had been with her on that unlucky plane had met with a destruction as complete as the ruined city above them. Clive glanced at her a little anxiously, wondering if he were putting too great a strain upon her, but it was essential that Angela should discover who she really was, if they were not to be faced with continuing embarrassments and uncertainties. The light was fading as they reached Bamiyan itself and drew up at the hotel, which was on top of a low hill directly opposite to the Buddhist ruins across the valley. Clive decreed that they should call it a day, and they went in to partake of the dinner, which the manager, who had been advised of their coming by telephone, had set for them in a screened-off portion of the dining room. The hotel was full of campers of various nationalities who had been up to Band-i-Amil, the mysterious lakes in the heart of mountainous desert, which had no visible source or origin, nor for the fish that swam in them. The Strattons dined on trout that had been brought down from them. When they sought their beds, Angela stood for a long time at the window looking across the valley to the sculptured cliff. There was a full moon, and the two great figures, tiny from that distance, were visible like rods of metal in the shadow of their niches. Again she was convinced that she stood in that same window before and gazed at that scene, but how, when, and with whom still eluded her. Clive watched her from the bed, unwilling to intrude upon her vigil, which might bear such fruitful results. He had blown out the lamp, and only the eerie moonlight illuminated the room. Angela, in her long wrap over her nightdress, was like a wraith herself in the pale light, except for her black hair streaming over her shoulders. At length he spoke. "Come to bed, dear. You'll be getting frozen. We'll visit Colossus in the morning." Bet you will. His voice broke the spell that enwrapped her. Shivering, she turned from the window and groped her way to bed. I don't think we should. I wish we hadn't come." "That's cowardly, Angela. Now we're here, we must go through with it." Naturally, he was hoping for results. Clive would like to know whom he had married, and her fears were stupid. Whatever was about to be revealed must be faced for his sake, if not for her own. Fears and apprehensions vanished in the safety of his arms. In the morning they stood halfway up the cliff at the foot of the bigger Colossus, looking up beyond the gigantic legs, the drapery, the shattered arms to the blind face far overhead, originally covered with gold leaf that had long disappeared, and the colours were weathered away. Of the frescoes which had decorated the niche, there were only faded fragments left, high up in the arched dome. The statue had been mutilated. Much of the face, the hands and limbs had been blasted away by zealous Moslem sharpshooters bent upon idol-breaking. The mouth and chin remained intact, carved in a serene smile. The whole cliff into which it was carved was pocked with empty niches and entrances to the hundreds of chambers within, for here had once lived a whole colony of monks. Angela held Clive's hand, clutched in hers, while her eyes wandered over the pink cliffs and back again to the Buddha. She knew it all. She had stood here before, staring up at the image with awe and wonder, hand in hand with another man. Suddenly his face swam before her vision, a lean-lined face with dark eyes like her own and a thatch of silver hair. She heard his voice say, "It's funny, isn't it, that so much that has been built by man to the glory of God has been despoiled by other men, also in the name of a god." "Daddy!" she gasped. "Oh, Daddy!" Clive put his arm around her. You were here with your father? Yes, we'd been on a dig in Persia. I told you I thought I had some connection with archaeology, and Daddy was an excavator of some note. He wanted to have a look at the northern cities, so we came in by Herat, went to Balkh. That's very old, isn't it? Very old, he said soothingly, unwilling to hurry her. We came down there, and went back, finally reaching Kizil Khala, intending to fly down to Kabul. I hadn't been to Kabul. Then... Her voice died away. Clive held her gently, stroking her head, but she did not weep, for she had always known that in that accident she had been bereft. But other memories were thronging back. She had gone on that dig not because she had been interested in archaeology, she never had been, but because she had needed distraction. Her mother had died after a long illness, through which she had nursed her. Arthur had promised to wait for her, for she had felt she could not desert her parent, and the end was inevitable. But it was too long in coming for Arthur. He had grown impatient and married another girl, or perhaps he had never really loved her. Doubly bereft. Her father had taken her with him to Persia, and now he had gone too. I've no one left, she said distractedly. You've got me, Clive reminded her. Come back to the hotel and lie down. I think a sedative would be a good idea. He led her away, guiding her over the stones and fallen masonry. She walked blindly, relying upon his supporting arm, her mind absorbed in her recollections. She had thought that she had loved Arthur. He had been a mainstay during those months of her mother's illness, and all the while he had been two-timing her. But even as she remembered him, he seemed infinitely remote, and she wondered how he had been able to cause her so much pain. But at the time when she had discovered his perfidy, she had walked into a desert of desolation. Her future a blank, and death with her father in that ravine would have been welcome. But Clive had brought her back to life and love, a deeper and far more profound emotion, because she was more mature. She said suddenly, You won't ever desert me, Clive? Surprised, he answered, Of course not, my dear. Whatever made you say that? Because there was someone who did. Oh, I was only engaged to him, but... Her lip quivered. So that was the trouble? But forget it, dear. Now you can really put the past away and look forward to a new life. I'll try to make up to you for all you've lost in the old. Oh, you will. I know you will. How infinitely kind and comforting he could be. He said after a while, Were you very devoted to your father? I adored him, but I didn't see very much of him. His work was always taking him away. Archaeology was his passion. Mother always declared he thought more of ruins than of living people. Yes, he returned with sudden violence. That sort of thing can become a mania, causing a man to neglect his nearest ties. Fleetingly, Angela recalled that Clive, too, had an obsession that might take him away from her, but he had said he would never desert her. I don't think Mother and Dad got on awfully well, she told him. They only kept together because of me, and then, when I became grown up, she was so ill. I nursed her. You don't seem to have had much of a life, my poor waif, Clive commented kindly. We'll hope there are better things in store for you. Arrived back at the hotel, he insisted that she should lie down, and he would give her a sedative. You need to adjust to your newly discovered past, he told her. A long sleep would help. Glass in one hand and pills in the other, he approached the bed upon which she was lying. Incidentally, have you remembered your name? My name? Why, of course. It's Anne, and that's not unlike Angela. She resolved that she would always use the latter name. It was the one Clive had given her, and doubly precious upon that account. But your surname, Clive persisted. That's more important. She knitted her brows. Something beginning with S. She paused, considering. Sullivan, she announced triumphantly. That's it. I'm Anne Sullivan. She looked up, expecting congratulation, and saw Clive had turned very white. He hurriedly put the glass down beside her. Sullivan, he echoed in a strangely strangled voice. Oh, no. Not Edmund Sullivan. That's right. Puzzled, she stared at him. You've heard of him? Yes. He was quite an eminent man in his line. He still spoke with difficulty. Didn't he head an expedition to Greece some 10 years ago to look for archived tombs? There were some rather unruly students in his team. I wouldn't know. I was only a schoolgirl then, but he often did take students. He liked to encourage young people. He did that all right, Clive said with such bitter meaning that Angela was more and more bewildered. He regarded her intently. Are you like your father, whom I never actually met? I mean, recognisably so. I don't think so. He was prematurely grey, a rather austere face. Clive gave her an odd glance, but she was not looking at him. She was visualising her father's appearance, the clean-cut features and well-set head. He had been handsome enough to cause hearts to flutter among his female admirers, but engrossed in his work he never noticed them. Her mother might complain of his long absences, but she had no reason to suspect infidelity. I think all that was alike was our eyes, she concluded. Why, does it matter? Not at all, Clive told her hastily, seeming to recollect her present need. Now drink this. He picked up the glass and handed her the pills. Obediently she swallowed them. Schooling his voice to gentleness, he bade her have a nice long sleep. She snuggled down into her pillows. Oh, I will, but you... What will you do, Clive? Sorry. I'll just have another look around. You won't go far? Anxiety sounded in her voice. He made an impatient gesture, then restrained himself. No, I won't go far. Reassured, she closed her eyes. Thank you for everything. He made no response, turning away from her to look across the valley towards the Buddha. For centuries the image had stood there smiling down upon the absurdities of mankind, indifferent to their puny passions. Clive turned from that example of divine detachment and looked at the sleeping girl, her black hair splayed on the pillow, her long lashes shadowing her cheeks. He gave a long sigh and went quietly out of the room. But the expression on his face when he looked at Angela had been inimical. Angela woke from a long sedated sleep, feeling refreshed and invigorated. She lay for a while going over her newfound memories. She had always known intuitively that her father had been with her on that plane, she decided, and that was why she had shrunk from facing the fact of his loss. The long snowbound weeks of oblivion had deadened the pain of her grief, which would have been much sharper if she had not been subconsciously preparing for the confirmation of his death. She had had too many blows in quick succession, her mother's decease, Arthur's desertion, and then the crash. Nature had done her best for her by dropping a veil between her and her memories, until she was strong enough to resist the shock, and she had wilfully sought to perpetuate it. As Clive had told her, she had not wanted to lift it. Now that she had recollected everything, there would be no need for Clive's psychiatrist. But where was Clive? It was growing dark, so she must have slept for a long time. While she made a hasty toilet, the hotel facilities were not very adequate, she examined curiously her girlish infatuation for Arthur, for she knew now that was all it had been, wondering at its intensity. Her feeling for him was as dead as a dodo, and she was thankful it could have no aftermath. It would have been devastating to discover she was still engaged to him. Angela went downstairs and found her husband had linked up with a party of German tourists, hearty, red-faced men who were downing potations, which certainly were not tea, with many prosts and much bonhomie. She was a little surprised, for Clive did not usually seek such company, at least as far as she knew he did not. But she realized anew how little she really knew him. She stood in the doorway of what passed for a lounge, observing him, noticing how clear-cut and aristocratic his features were, how slim and lithe his figure compared with his companion's stocky forms and blunt faces. He wore, as they did, an open shirt and slacks, but even in that casual garb he contrived to look elegant. Her heart swelled with love and gratitude as she watched him. Where would she be but for him? If she had survived, she would probably be existing half-demented among the Nuristani. Unable to give an account of herself and accorded the veneration they extended to crazy people as the smitten by God. She knew she had been on the verge of losing her mind altogether, and only his patience and care had saved her sanity. Care which he would have given to any pathetic creature that had needed it, and which had found its final expression in their marriage. But that, she thought sadly, was all that had motivated him. His desire for her body was merely desire. In all essentials they were actually complete strangers. and that was a poor foundation for a lasting union. Since their arrival in Kabul, he had become an enigma to her. The bearded doctor in the Hindu Kush had been something of a paternal figure, and she had thought she understood him. But he bore little resemblance to the clean-shaven man who had emerged from the cocoon of his winter garb upon their first morning at the hotel. She sensed Clive Stratton was far more complex than she had imagined. There were so many different facets to him. The doctor, the author, and explorer, Jasmine's husband, and latterly her own lover, if she could call him that, who never spoke of love except with contempt as a youthful fantasy. Clive looked up and saw her, hovering in the doorway. "Hello." "Hello. Woken up, have you?" He called. Who is this one? He called cheerfully. "Come and have a drink. Gentlemen, my wife." She went forward, recalling almost with surprise that she really was his wife. Anne Sullivan had ceased to be. The other men seemed to be a little embarrassed by her appearance. They had not expected to find a woman staying in their hotel. They were not, they explained in German, which she could not understand, suitably clad for a lady's company. Clive laughed at their punctiliousness and invited them to join them for dinner. Angela was sorry that he had done that. She was eager to talk about her recently discovered past. Gradually it was borne in upon her that was exactly what her husband did not wish her to do. During the meal she occasionally caught his eyes upon her with a strange expression, almost as though he disliked her. She dismissed the impression as her fancy. She was in a hypersensitive condition and liable to misread the most innocent glances. To her disappointment, Clive arranged with his guests to explore the valley by moonlight. The Buddha, they agreed, would look fantastic by night, and there was an ancient stairway going up into its giant head, from which there would be a remarkable view. "You don't mind, Angela, do you?" Clive asked perfunctorily. "It'll be too rough walking for you, and the staircase is no doubt pretty rotten." "You'll take care," she said anxiously. "I'm not a rash boy," he rebuked her, with an impatient frown. "You'd better get all the rest you can before our journey back tomorrow." She forbore to mention that she had been resting all the afternoon. Evidently this was to be a men's expedition, and they meant to go fast and far, so she had no choice but to agree. For as she had told him before their marriage, she meant never to be an encumbrance when he wanted to explore. But not at Bamiyan, she thought, as she sat in her bedroom window, watching their figures diminish with the distance as they crossed the valley, and not tonight of all nights. Uneasily she wondered if her return to normalcy had broken her hold over Clive. Possibly he preferred her to be the nameless waif whom he had succoured. It was a disquieting idea. Then she remembered that he had proposed to have her psychoanalyzed, and dismissed it as another figment of excited fancy. Unhappily she went to bed, longing for her husband's return, but though she lay awake for a long time, he did not appear. Very late, or rather early, she heard sounds of carousal downstairs. He must be whooping it up with his new acquaintances, but that again was uncharacteristic of Clive. She decided that he had been starved of male companionship, for the Nuristani were more specimens to be studied than congenial friends, and being Moslems they did not drink. She supposed that was what was attractive about the brash Germans. Men seemed to have an incomprehensible urge to drink together. She finally fell asleep to the distant strains of Deutschland über alles. During the long drive back, she could not kid herself that there was not a distinct atmosphere. Excuse me. Clive was aloof and withdrawn. He made comments about the country through which they were passing, but half his mind seemed to be elsewhere. At last, in desperation, she inquired, "What's wrong, Clive? I thought you wanted me to recover my memory. Now you seem displeased." "Of course I'm not," he said quickly. "It's not that." He hesitated. "Those fellows last night made me feel restless." Her heart sank. "Regretting your bachelor freedom?" She tried to speak lightly. "The wilderness presents no problems except survival." "The wilderness presents no problems except survival," he observed cryptically. "That's one of its great advantages. But I really must go home." She sensed conflict between inclination and duty, and wished he would be more open with her. Surely as his wife she was entitled to his confidence. But Clive was a man who would always make his own decisions without consulting others, and perhaps he feared to hurt her feelings by confessing he was desirous of leaving her. He did then make an effort, and it was an obvious effort, to interest himself in her affairs. He asked if she had any near relatives whom she would like to contact when she reached England. She shook her head. Daddy was an only child and his parents were dead. I have some aunts and uncles on mother's side, but we didn't have much to do with them. They had deplored their sister's continual complaints and had not been helpful during her last illness, being engrossed in their own families. Since Angela had nothing else to do, she was adequate to cope. Also, she had found they were critical of her father for being so much away, but since his work took him far afield, he could not be blamed for that. Any aspersion on her beloved father instantly roused Angela in his defence, and her hot words had not endeared her to her relations. "They'll have been told I was killed in the crash with Daddy," she went on. "I don't think I'll bother to let them know I survived. At least, not yet." She would also have to tell them she was married, and she did not want to have to inform them of that. They would be altogether too inquisitive. Clive seemed relieved by her decision, and he said compassionately, "You do seem alone in the world, my poor waif. And I'm afraid I haven't much to offer you by way of a family either." "All I want is you," she told him, her heart in her eyes. But he was watching the road, and at the fervour in her voice he looked faintly embarrassed. "Thank you, dear," he said perfunctorily. "There's just one thing," he hesitated. "Yes, Clive?" "I don't like saying this, but it would be as well if you don't mention your maiden name to my people. Mother once knew some Sullivans whom she disliked intensely. It might prejudice her against you." She stared at his profile wide-eyed. "How could it? You sound as if you thought my father had been a criminal, Clive." "Of course I'm not suggesting anything of the sort. It's just, you know how unreasonable women can be about unimportant details." She felt vaguely disturbed, as if she had been asked to deny her father, but because she was always anxious to please Clive, she told him, "It seems quite absurd to me, but if you wish it, I won't ever mention poor Daddy, nor our name, but please understand that I'm proud to be his daughter." "Naturally. It's only that the name has unpleasant associations for Celia." With a gleam of humour, she remarked, "And it's going to be difficult enough to persuade her to accept a poor waif without such an unfortunate label." "Oh, she'll take to you all right," he said without conviction. Do we have to live with her?" "No. If she doesn't want to leave Abbotswood, we'll get another house. All that's got to be arranged when I get back. Of course, it would be splendid if you managed to hit it off with Mother. You wouldn't be lonely then if I want to go away." "But I thought—" She checked herself. She had told him that she would not try to keep him from his exploratory adventures, but she had not expected he would want to go so soon, and he had talked about settling down. Was he going to dump her at this place in Dorset and wash his hands of her? He said with careful casualness, "Hans Klaus is planning an expedition into the Bolivian jungle." It sounded rather fun. Hans had been one of the German party at Bamiyan, so this was what they had been hatching when he had sat up half the night with them. She tried to fight an increasing sense of desolation. Clive had rescued her, married her, and was already tired of her. "You must go if you want to do so," she said stonily. "It was just a thought, but I doubt if I can get away." That statement gave her some comfort. It was a pity they had gone to Bamiyan and met the young men who had so unsettled him. Perhaps a pity, too, that she had discovered her identity. She had a curious impression that both happenings were linked. They reached Kabul in time for dinner, and Angela found to her relief that Mrs. Newcombe had moved on. Clive, however, seemed to regret her. "She was quite amusing company," he observed. "And you don't find mine exactly scintillating," she said a little bitterly. "Comparisons are odious," he quoted. "You're bright enough at times, but tonight you look very tired. You'd better go to bed early." She was very sleepy, having slept so badly the night before. "Aren't you coming up?" "I've various things to do first, before our early start tomorrow, and I think it might be as well to call upon the consul and tell him we've discovered who you are. He may keep me very late." She had the impression that he was making excuses to avoid being alone with her. Something was very wrong, and she determined to demand an explanation when he came to bed. But she was very tired, and she was sound asleep long before he returned. That he did come back was evident from his rumpled bed, but he was up and had gone downstairs when the waiter brought her tea. And over breakfast he was so withdrawn and taciturn she decided to let the matter rest. She concluded that he was resenting his lost freedom and the necessity to return home. There could be no other reason. And once he became reconciled to the inevitable, he would become his pleasant self again. Grown men, she thought indulgently, could be very like small boys when they were thwarted and had to do what they did not want to do.